Hi, everybody. Good morning to everyone, and welcome to day 4 of TMF Week. I am your host, Kimberly Bruce, Marketing Coordinator at Montreal, and I am pleased to be hosting today's session 2, which is bear traps and honeypots, standardizing documents, management approaches to real-world studies. I'm here with Russell and Stuart, and they are going to be the speakers today. I just wanted to go over a little bit of housekeeping rules. So this is a Q&A session. You guys can write your questions in the chat or in the Q&A section at the top right corner. And there will be a poll, so please make sure to get in your answers in there in the poll section at the top right corner. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation, so feel free to get all of your questions in there. Stuart and Russell will be pleased to answer all of them. And this is what, like I said yesterday, TMF Week is all about learning, so make sure to get your questions out there. Just so that you know, this is going to be recorded and you'll be able to have access to it after the presentation ends. So be on the lookout for that, as well as the slides. All attendees will be receiving attendance certificates, so be on the lookout for that 7 days after the TMF Week ends. And don't forget to network. Network is really important, so you can connect with your peers and colleagues, and also don't forget to visit the virtual exhibit hall. So that is going to be a lot of fun. Before we start the presentation, I wanted to introduce speakers. So we have Russell Joyce, Director of Keith Barrowcliff Consulting, the Director of the Health Sciences Records and Archives Association, active member of the TMF Reference Model Steering Committee, and project lead for the recently published Real-World Evidence Study Master File. His particular interests are in information governance, evidential weight, digital archiving, and the use of enabling technologies to optimize processes, enhance operational efficiencies, and improve study and data integrity. So welcome, Russell. And then we have Stuart McCulley, CEO at Phoenix RW Limited, founder of Phoenix RW Limited, the architect behind NIST and Regs.com, and co-founder of Redbird. Stuart is a passionate and about helping people and understand how to get from concept to close out for clinical studies that don't fit the well-defined pathways of clinical trials, hence his interest and expertise in real-world research studies. So welcome, Stuart. We're pleased to have you guys here. So moving forward now, I'm just going to switch over my screen. Hold on 1 second. Technical difficulty here.
So while Kim's dealing with these technical difficulties, I should apologize that our professional photos look a lot better than we do. So I'm just going to set the scene for the rest of this presentation. So speaking is Stuart, and if anyone knows the Muppets, I'm Stadler and Russell is Waldorf, and this is how the presentation is going to go. So thank you very much for the introduction, Kim. Both Russell and I are very appreciative of this opportunity to talk. So what we're going to be talking about is, as the title says, bear traps and honeypots, standardizing document management approaches to real-world research. Next slide. My job is to line up what real-world research is or are, studies are, and I will then hand over to Russell, who will go into detail about what we've created in order to remove the pain points for those of you who have real-world research studies, such as observational studies, that have been trying to fit them into a clinical trial TMF. We feel your pain, which is why we're talking about this today. Next slide. Real-world research studies, it's a term that I've created because what we're talking about is a form of clinical research that collects real-world data and from that generates real-world evidence. And according to the FDA, real-world evidence is the clinical evidence regarding the usage and the benefits and risks of a medical product derived from the analysis of real-world data. There are primarily two forms or two categories of real-world studies, and these are the pragmatic clinical trials, also known as comparative effectiveness trials, and the second category is non-interventional studies or observational studies. We're focusing primarily on category 2. So that's non-interventional studies, a term we use in Europe, or observational studies, a term we use globally. Next slide. There has been a significant increase in regulator interest in real-world evidence and the studies that generate real-world evidence in the last 5 years. That was triggered by the 21st Century Cures Act in 2016, and since then we've seen a plethora of regulator guidelines on what the quality expectations are and how to not only conduct these studies, but also how to submit them. And in 2020, unsurprisingly, EMA called for high-quality observational studies that were conducted in the context of COVID-19 vaccines and medicines. And when we're looking at high quality, one of the cores to that is how you manage your documentation to prove what it is you have done, haven't done, and what approvals you have managed to get in the national and regional requirements, etc. So next slide. And for those that are asking, before you ask, yes, you can have a copy of the slides. I wanted to highlight here a very recent publication from the FDA, and what they did was they looked at where real-world evidence had been used to leverage regulatory submissions. So this publication is worth a look because it looks at 90 regulatory submissions for medical devices. But you can take the inference to medicinal products as well. And I'm going to read these, which is what I don't usually do, but I'm reading these because they're important. According to the FDA, advances in the availability of real-world data sources, such as electronic health records, registries, we also call them observational studies, medical claims, pharmacy data, and feedback from wearables and mobile technology, have increased the potential to generate robust real-world evidence to support FDA regulatory submissions and EMA and other countries. Here's an interesting statement. The real-life clinical performance of a medical product might be more clearly demonstrated through real-world evidence because a controlled clinical trial often cannot evaluate all applications of a product in clinical practice across the full range of potential users. And the last but not least point, real-world evidence can be leveraged to bring new products to market, evaluate the safety and effectiveness of existing products for new uses, and assess the continued performance and safety of products once on the market. So we've set the regulatory framework and we've introduced real-world studies. These are studies that generate real-world evidence, such as observational studies. Next slide. Now we're going to jump into the bear traps. Obviously not literally jump into a bear trap, because that's stupid. But what I wanted to illustrate are 4 pain points that are common to non-interventional or observational studies. The first one is that the terminology, unlike for clinical trials, is not standardized. There is a lot of white noise out there, and the regulatory definitions are confused often with methodological definitions. Next slide. So what you actually need to do is look at what is the regulatory foundation and framework for non-interventional studies. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but first and foremost, you've got to look at the ethical principles, Declaration of Helsinki. Got to look at the applicable guidelines, GPP, pharmaceutical self-regulation, PhRMA in the US, IFPA in Europe, and then you've got to look at the national regulations. And this leads us on to pain point number 2, or bear trap number 2. Kim, next slide. So bear trap or pain point number 2 is the fact that every country has a different regulatory requirement for non-interventional or observational studies. So you need to be aware of this so that you can then be compliant with it. Next slide. This is a biggie. So this is a whole week on the trial master file. And the source reference for trial master files is section 8 of ICAG 6 or GCP. You've got to ask the question, is GCP actually applicable to non-interventional studies or observational studies? Next slide. So it isn't a question of whether it's applicable, it's a question of why is GCP legally enforceable for clinical trials? And the reason why it's enforceable for clinical trials is GCP is embedded within the applicable national clinical trial regulations. It says that you need to comply with GCP. Why do you comply with GCP? It's ICH E6. E means efficacy. That whole efficacy series is all about clinical trials. It all makes a lot of sense if that's what you're doing. What happens if you're not doing a clinical trial? This is where you actually find you have jumped into the bear trap and you're in a whole world of pain. Next slide. What you find is that the requirements to comply with GCP are not embedded in the NIS regulations, and you wouldn't expect them to be because they're not clinical trials. If that's the case, if GCP isn't either applicable or not a legal mandate, what do you do about the trial master file? Excuse me. So that leads us on to pain point number 4. Sorry. Kim. So pain point number 4 is the fact that for non-interventional studies and observational studies, the trial master file or the document management requirements are not standardized. And we've just given you an illustration here of some of the country requirements for document retention for non-interventional studies based on their legislation, or in the case of Germany, based on their pharmaceutical best practice. What tends to happen with human nature is if there is a gap, you fill it. And in this case, what we tend to do is we fill the TMF requirement gap for non-interventional studies with the clinical trial requirements. And this is where the whole world of pain, and I'm sure you have experienced it if you do these types of studies, comes, which leads us on to the next slide, which is the segue to Russell telling us about what we have done to address this. But first and foremost, Kim is going to give you a poll, a couple of questions that we'd like answered.
That is correct. So poll is now live. And the question is, are you running a real world study? Yes or no? You can go into the poll section at the top right corner next to the Q&A section. It is now open, so please give in your responses. We're going to let that run for about maybe 10-15 seconds. So get on there and get those answers in. Coming in. Keep coming. I see. It's looking like it's oh, now it's changing because it was like 50-50 at one point. Oh, and now it is. We're going to give it another 5 seconds. And we're ending the poll. So it looks like yes got 51, I should say 52%, and no got 48% there. And then the second question, if so, are you using the TMF reference model? Yes or no? So we're going live with this next poll here. Remember, get your answers in. We're going to run this for about maybe, again, 10-15 seconds. Want to make sure to get all of your responses, and we'll make sure to show the results after it's done. So another 10 seconds. Loving it. It's really cool to see these numbers going in, and I'm loving the fact that people are engaged because they're actually getting into this poll. And we're going to end it now. So the results are, if so, are you using the TMF reference model? And 91% said yes, and 8% said no, or 9% said no.
Yeah.
So showing the results here. So that's pretty cool. Was that what you guys expected? Stuart and Russell? Was that what you guys expected for the answer?
Probably.
Yeah.
Probably, I think it would. I think we've missed out on a question here, Stuart, which is how difficult is that proving?
Yeah. Honestly, when
I think we're rather surprised.
When I see those figures, I feel the world of pain that these people are in. So it's perfect for Russell's talk now.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
So if we go to the next slide, thanks, Stuart. So as Stuart was saying there, anyone involved in real-world studies will know that trying to file your real-world studies documentation into the existing trial master file reference model can prove challenging, somewhat akin, if you like, to trying to unravel a Gordian knot. Those challenges arise because, as Stuart was saying, the trial master file reference model is designed specifically around ICH GCP requirements for clinical trials. And as we know, ICH GCP does not apply to real-world studies. In reality, then, every time you start a new real-world study, you start from the beginning. If it's your organization's policy to use the trial master file reference model as your baseline, you end up contorting yourself trying to shoehorn your requirements into that model so that it fits your particular needs, switching off what's not applicable and what's not relevant, and hoping that, above all, that an auditor of your real-world study, TMF, understands your type of study and doesn't penalize you for any missing documents or documents that were never generated because your study isn't a clinical trial. So trying to unravel that Gordian knot to convince an auditor that ICH GCP does not apply to your real-world study is often, more often than not, a thankless task. So with the increasing use of real-world studies to support drug developments, product licensing, label claims and reimbursements, it was becoming increasingly clear that there was a need for an audit-ready framework for real-world studies, one that accurately referenced the documents needed to provide evidence of the integrity of the study conduct and the data produced. So thanks to Stuart, help was soon at hand. Next slide, please. So back in 2018, Stuart gathered a team of real-world study subject matter experts who, over a 2-year period, consumed copious amounts of tea and cake, though I don't ever recall honey cake being on the menu, and spent an equally significant amount of time and effort battling their way through a staggering plethora of regulations to develop a study master file template for real-world studies. This was initially known as a real-world study index. So working under the auspices of the Trial Master File Reference Group, we were under an obligation to adopt and adapt the existing reference model structure, deviating only when it was necessary to align with RWS regulations and terminology. What we'd expected to be a rather long exploration deep into the 100-acre wood to keep the bear reference going there in search of that elusive honeypot actually proved far more elusive and difficult than perhaps we had ever imagined. But the group took great pains to consider the ethical standards, regulatory requirements, guidelines, and industry best practices applicable to real-world studies. Clearly, we certainly found ourselves venturing deep into rabbit holes and those occasional bear traps that Stuart was talking about there. I think it was harder than we had ever envisaged, but ensuring consistency with the reference model made it somewhat complex to engineer the maze of the real-world studies regulations into that framework. But we made it. So what was the outcome? If it's next slide, please. So to a great extent, we were able to keep faithful to the brief and to remain as consistent as we could with the TMF reference model. But this model related to real-world studies, not clinical trials, and so we renamed it a study master file. We also took great care to ensure that the terminology that we used was aligned with real-world studies, changing throughout the word trial for study, subject for patient, and changing things like safety reporting for pharmacovigilance. In doing so, we avoided the use of company-specific terminology, focusing on more readily accessible and universally understood generic terms that were used in the regulations. And we hope that this simplification would help to foster engagement with present and future stakeholders, as well as encourage adoption of the final model. So with the exception of the clinical supplies section, we retained all of the zones. When it came to the sections, we identified just over half as being relevant. The same applied to artifacts or document types, which number 130 in the study master file, but 249 in the TMF reference model. And reflecting the difference in regulatory requirements, the real-world studies group found fewer than 11 artifacts to be core, but 119 were recommended, almost a reversal of the standard reference model in which a larger proportion of the artifacts are core. So these were adaptations that were needed to make it relevant, but overall we managed to maintain the integrity of the original reference model structure. Next slide, please, Kimberly, thank you. So anyone familiar with the TMF reference model then will be immediately familiar with the study master file too. This not only ensures consistency and user friendliness, but also means that those running real world studies have the opportunity to adopt eTMF technologies to improve the management of their studies. So like its progenitor, the model comprises zones, each zone subdivided into sections and each section into artifacts that, in the opinion of the RWS group at least, would be expected in a real-world study. We retained the term artifact because the study master file contains information recorded in a variety of different ways, including records, documents, and data. So an artifact is information that is captured during a clinical study that meets the purpose or definition described in the model. In some cases, the artifact may be a single document, a data set, or a piece of separate information. Next slide, please. So in terms of the deliverables, well, the result of the efforts of the RWS group is the study master file. Like the TMF reference model, it's an Excel listing, but it's relevant to real-world studies. We believe that this provides a much needed framework for anyone involved in the conduct of these particular studies. Unlike the reference model, TMF reference model, the study master file is available in two different formats. We have the real world study document index, which is a distilled version available to download for free from the TMF reference model website. This version was the one approved by the TMF reference model steering committee on the 29th of July last year. We refer to this one as the distilled version because it doesn't contain all of the guidance, text, glossary, or information on the scope of the SMF that's contained in the study master file itself. So the study master file itself is also available to download for free from the study master file website, which is on screen now. This is a more detailed and comprehensive version. You can think of this, if you like, as the raw data, the distilled RWS document index, plus all the additional guidance and instructions for use. So this one is particularly useful for anyone who wants to understand the scope of the study master file and the context of the sections, zones, and artifacts. And it includes a glossary of terms, guidance and context on how to use the document, the study master file, and details of the types of real-world studies that the study master file was designed to support. And on the next screen, you'll see a selection of the different types of RWS that we were trying to reflect in the study. Now, there are some 50, if we can have next slide, please, Kimberly. So on this slide, you have 50 different studies covered by the study master file. So in designing the study master file, we very purposefully aimed to cover the widest range of possible study types and the fullest listing of the artifacts we would expect, irrespective of the study type. So here you'll have everything that we took into consideration. Although not every artifact listed in the study master file will be relevant to every single study, The comprehensiveness of the study master file means that it should be easy for you to include or exclude artifacts based on your study type. Next slide, please. So what do you get with the standard study master file? We've, like the reference model, the focus was to introduce both standardization and flexibility. As a consequence, we have the same 4 key pillars. We have predefined content. So that you have consistent interpretations of what is needed based on expert peer opinion that avoids scope creep. We have predefined naming conventions to avoid one artifact being referred to by different terms within an organization and between organizations. We have a predefined structure to facilitate consistent filing and rapid retrieval, which is critically helpful when sharing information with others who are responsible for the conduct of the studies, and the responsibility is distributed across several parties. And we have predefined metadata to encourage the adoption of good practice across the industry for the exchange of content and to facilitate document identification and retrieval. Outside of these 4 pillars, there is that flexibility so that each organization can adapt the model to meet both its specific organizational needs and enable adaptation for specific clinical study types, so that where required, those artifacts can be included and excluded to meet those differing requirements. Next slide, please. And in terms of the benefits that you gain from using the study, it really is a stepping stone on the road to achieving our end goal. In the study master file, we have the honeypot, but without the honey dipper or the twizzle stick. So what we have here is a large range of different benefits that you get, including the standardization and the flexibility, to encourage a consistent approach to document collection, document management, and retrieval. And these are all important components needed to comply with data integrity guidelines and good documentation practice. So the introduction of this standardized structure, the naming conventions, avoids the company-specific terminology, which plagues RWS, content and structure. So hopefully this will facilitate study conduct and also speed content identification, introduce efficiencies, enhance inspection readiness, and enable a greater oversight throughout the conduct of the study. Moreover, though, what we hope is that use of the study master file will encourage the adoption of best practices in real-world studies and optimize operations, improve outcomes, and herald a much-needed sense of harmonization across the industry. Next slide, please. So as I said, this is very much a stepping stone. We need to have our honey dippers or our twizzle sticks in order to gain maximum advantage from it. If we found our honey pot but can't get the honey out, then it's been of little value. So technology is going to be key to delivering on our promises. But the study master file, like the trial master file, neither endorses nor requires any specific technology. It doesn't like the trial master file reference model, the SMF is technology agnostic. The standardized structure is aligned with the TMF reference model, and so any standard out-of-the-box eTMF technology will be more than suitable as your document management system. And of course, the structure can be replicated and adapted for the digital and for the paper environment. Although there's guidance relating to different study types in the study master file to help you define your document requirements in your study master file structure, there is no detailed regulatory intelligence by study type or country. However, Stuart does provide an excellent, comprehensive and up-to-date resource of all real-world study regulatory information and intelligence at nisregs.com. And if you're interested in running a real-world studies, I'd urge you not to leave home without it. And of course, as with all studies, you'll need to introduce information governance frameworks, such as policies, SOPs, work instructions to define your processes, some kind of management plan to define your content, correct setup, usage and maintenance of your study master file. Responsibility matrices to define creation, management, ownership, and transfer of content. Quality control plans to check your content relevance and completeness, and have business rules to define your information creation, management, and processing. And last slide, please. So what's for the future? So we've been on a journey, definitely. The study master file is now published, but this is far from the end of that journey. What we really need is for people, for practitioners, to start using the study master file and to provide us with feedback so that we can learn lessons from those using it in the real world on real world studies, so that we can begin to the process of continuous improvement, so that we can add value and look forward to a new generation of the study master file. So if you're not using it, please do start using it. No feedback is ever too small. You can provide that feedback via the Study Master File website or via the Trial Master File Reference Model website. The RWS continues to meet frequently to focus not just on the dissemination of this knowledge and to explain the Study Master File, but also to consolidate input from stakeholders and make those improvements that you feel are necessary to render this really valuable in the real world. So with that, thank you very much for listening. I think we have a few moments for questions. And hopefully that's got the session finished on time, which I was keen to do.
Bravo. Very good. Thank you very much, Russell and Stuart. That was very insightful. And just going to move this along here and move that from the screen. So now we're going to take some questions here. Loving the fact that people are very much engaged with the session, with your presentation. So we're just going to go into questions right now. So it says here, GCP is just, or maybe this is more of a comment, GCP is just a guideline. So we need to adhere to the law for their respective countries. So this is somebody that had made a comment on that. And also for ICH GCP, the archiving timeline is 3 years, but in Indian GCP, 5 years is mentioned for archival. What should we have to follow? So this is something that they were asking about.
Yeah, okay, so there's two elements here. First and foremost, I need to apologise for the fact that Russell used the word moreover. It's not acceptable. Anyway, sorry, great face. This is a very serious session. So Neladri, I'm sorry if I've mispronounced your name, so please correct me. It's an interesting one. I just checked my notes on the requirements for real-world studies for India. There is no mention of the archiving requirements, and the 5 years that you mentioned there aligns with ISPI GPP. So what I would always recommend for people is that if there is no overarching or national regulation with regards to what you need to archive for a certain period of time, I would always revert to GPP. And the reason I say that is certainly EMA, Health Canada and BfArM have suggested that we follow that. So what we're seeing is a trend that regulators are looking at this as a baseline alternative to GCP. It's not implemented in regulations, but it's certainly defensible as to what you're doing and why.
Yeah, and for anybody that doesn't know, ISPI GPP has the requirement to maintain your records from 5 years from the date of the end of the study or the date of the final study report, if that helps. So it's a much reduced amount of time compared to a standard clinical trial, which under the new EU 536/2014 regulation will be 25 years or 30.
Quite reasonable.
Not verbatim, Stuart.
So one thing I would like to add here, and you know, we've had a very serious presentation, straight faces, TMF. Please bear in mind that these are real world research studies. And generally, when I'm looking at these types of studies, you can have up to 11 different types of study per country. So it's a massive field compared to the GCP clinical trial world. And there is a lot of confusion, but just distill it down and say, okay, what is applicable, what isn't? If I don't have a standard for a TMF, what should I then be complying with? And this is where the compliance aspect comes into, and Russell can either tell me I'm talking nonsense or verify this. You at least have to justify what you're doing in the absence of something that tells you what you should do. And that's where I think, you know, GPP, ISPE GPP really gives you that kind of baseline. Russell?
No, I'd agree with that. I think whatever you're doing, you need to be able to justify it. And in the absence of any regulation, I think the GCP standards are generally best practice. They are, if you like, the gold standard. And in the presentation there, I referred to the GXP data integrity guidance and good documentation practice. Not strictly applicable to real world studies, but it is the best standard that's available there. So our recommendation as a group is that you apply those standards in order to cover yourself so that you can rely on the information, the data and the documents that you have to be trustworthy and reliable because their integrity is being maintained.
So Russell, let me throw a spanner in the works here. So for Europe, for those of you that are running, say, non-interventional studies or non-interventional post-authorization studies, anything that's prospective in Europe with regards to real-world research, you also need to take into consideration the pharmacovigilance requirements. And that tends to be you have to maintain the documentation from those studies 10 years after the product is no longer on the market. So, you know, that's pretty much forever. So please, you know, for those of you that are doing these types of studies and you're a marketing authorization holder, please bear in mind that you have those pharmacovigilance document retention requirements.
Yeah, and the requirement is actually to keep the pharmacovigilance master file for, permanently. So that's quite correct, Stuart. Yeah. I hate the term permanently because nothing can be retained permanently. You've just got to walk around.
Russell, look at the state of us. When we started doing this, we had hair, we were slim, we were young.
I've had slippage on the hair, Stuart. That's the difference.
Oh, yeah.
Very good points, guys. I have, there's another question here. For the SMF, was every column scrubbed from the TMF RM and realigned to the RWE?
So when we designed the study master file, we kept all the columns that were going to be relevant. So for example, in the standards trial master file reference model, you have a column that provides a reference to the ICH GCP regulations. Clearly that's not applicable, and so we scrubbed that. But anything that was relevant, we kept. And we made sure that all of those columns, all of the cells, all of the rows were populated with information. So there are no blank cells on there. If anything was blank, we clearly marked that as not applicable. So if you go to the study master file reference site and download for free what we've created, you'll see there the study master file looks very, very similar in content to the standard clinical trials reference model. If you really want to have a look at the changes that were made, I believe Karen has maintained the markup of the TMF reference model to the study master file. And if that's not available on the trial master file reference website, we can send a copy to you if you want to contact us or contact us via Kimberly. That's absolutely fine, and we can let you have that. But we were under strict instruction to maintain the structure as much as we possibly could. So we did.
Russell, what I was going to add to that is the reason why it took us probably, 2 years to create this is we had to go through the pain of looking at all of the different study types based on the national regulations and say, you know, what is it we need here? Because the reason why we stepped up and tried to create this was it was very clear that if you try to mold your study into the reference model with a hammer or a sledgehammer or a pickaxe, it just was painful. And it wasn't very practical, and there was a lot of rework. So that's where we've come from with regards to keep what the framework, but also reduce to the point where it's practical and usable.
Absolutely.
Good. And I think we have time for like one more question, and let me just find that it over here. Is this an FDA guidance? Is this an FDA guidance? The questions that was there.
Not that I'm aware, Stuart.
No. I could be flippant at this point, but I won't. I'm trying to keep my serious face.
I love the serious face.
It's definitely best practice guidance. Yep.
Okay. Best practice.
Not regulated.
No, it's not regulated at this point.
No? Okay. Let me just see if there's...
Hopefully, in exactly the same way as the trial master file was never regulated, it's not a requirement. We hope that the study master file achieves the same status. So it's not regulated, but actually people see it as best practice, and it becomes adopted as best practice through universal usage.
Right, so let me quickly add to that. I'm conscious we have a couple of minutes here. So the FDA has provided guidance for industry on what should be submitted and what they're expecting. The EMA recently, 2018, they produced a draft consultation with regards to registries and registry studies. So registry studies, observational studies. But they told us what the expectations were for quality. There were so many comments that came back to that they binned that, full stop. 2020, September or October, they released a new guidance document. And pretty much what they're saying is, in order for an observational study to be of sufficient quality to be acceptable to the regulator, you have to abide by these standards. So bear in mind that there are standard expectations for regulators, but also if you have an artifact of the TMF reference model that says this is how we document things, and we are taking quality standards seriously, all of a sudden you're in a position where you have something that you can present to a regulator to say, not only have we taken on board the quality, but we actually have a standard, which is what we have with the RWS DI. So
it's an attempt to ensure that people are keeping their documents in a systematic and consistent way. That's really its primary aim, I think.
Well, you know, I remember the days when people said to me, it's a non-interventional study, therefore it's not regulated. Wrong. And therefore we don't need a TMF. Really? You know, let's get real, people. You know, this is clinical research. It involves human participants. There are ethical and regulatory standards, and we have to abide by them. How do we demonstrate that? We do that in the RWS DI.
Very good points, guys. Thank you so much for the discussion. Thank you so much for the presentation. This was absolutely very insightful, very informative. And thank you so much for getting all of the questions answered. So with the next step right now is the next session. So the next session is going to be standardizing of eTMF, drawing parallels in industry with Paul Fenton. And just wanted to let you know that it's time to network. So get on to the lounge, go to the lounge and meet your colleagues, meet your peers, go to the booth, just, you know, have a conversation. It's a lot of fun because this is what TMF Week is all about. And I'd like to thank Stuart and Russell thank you so much for all of your insights and knowledge. This was absolutely amazing talk. So
Thank you.
I'll meet you guys over at the lounge and talk soon.
Cheers.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.